grasp it. But like reading something like Kant, where
You just can't.
like art is like okay, so it's 50 pages that could have been cut down to 20 if you just like stopped repeating it at the same time and writing a sentence that could have been 4 words in 112.
Well, I mean, it wouldn't be Kant then. It would be Kant for dummies.
Mm-hmm. But I'm glad that we're reading sociologists now because the philosophers, Tolstoy, Hegel, I'm tired.
Oh yeah. Tolstoy is inscrutable at the best of times.
I was like, why are we contradicting ourselves in the same sentence?
That's what philosophers do. It's their deal. It's their shtick. Okay. Am I good? Do I need... Oh, yes. Oh, thank you. There we go.
Also, in the fourth mini lab, when you're asking us to make up qualitative data, do you want us to like actually pretend that we're answering it from their perspective, or say like, oh, they could answer like questions on this topic or this topic?
Just like, yeah, more like what, like if you were like hypothesizing on what people might answer, what do you think they might answer, and therefore like, I don't know, I forget what the rest of the assignment is, but
so like just like a short tiny like excerpt of what
how
you would possibly have.
Exactly, yeah. Just so you can kind of like think it through a little bit. Okay, I'm echoey now. But yeah, that's all. Like it doesn't have to be crazy or major. Like they're meant to be quick to do, right? But just to kind of try and think through like what the process would be and how you would interpret it and that sort of stuff. Yeah.
And also with the assignment after that, you're asking us to interview someone. I assume you want us to record what they would have said, like if we.
So you don't need to you don't need to like transcribe it or anything. Okay. Just like ask them the questions and like get their feedback on what hey, what questions worked, what questions didn't, how's the flow, right? Are there any problem questions? If they're not part of your like research group, just have them like play act. It doesn't have to be like going to do a real interview with someone. It's just like field test your questions, right? Someone who can like, it could be your mom if you want, right? And she just has to pretend that, she's a 40-year-old biker named Steve, right? That's good enough for me as long as you're testing that the questions work. Yeah. And if you learn anything from it, like, okay, this question clearly didn't work. She's just way ahead of the game if you're wondering what I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah. No, I was before when she said.
Oh, yeah. She's just looking ahead to assignments that haven't been assigned yet.
Small assignments I can do now so that I'm not completely forgetting about them during the end of exam season.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Tell me about it. Yeah, if you want to use the same topic, if that's like something you think will work across both, you can stick to the same topic. Obviously, you need a different research question and all that stuff, but yeah, you don't have to change radically. I'm not really keeping track because my brain is broken. What time is it? 2:01. Did I turn the live stream on? I don't even know anymore. Oh, it's been a day. My wife's going to be mad at me for not eating lunch again. Oh, I know. I've been bad. I have no time. All right. Well, let's get going. I can live on coffee and tea. They have enough calories, right? Black coffee and clear tea. Yeah. That's enough for an adult human male, right?
Well, what is water?
What is it? I mean, it's basically sugar, except not so much. Okay. I'm going to say okay way too many times. I'm really sorry. I say okay a lot. It's like my okay. Let's do this. All right. Let's go. Da-da, da-da, da-da. We're going to talk about ethnography today. So, this is our first of our big, shiny qualitative research methods is ethnography. So ethnography, interviews are number one. Ethnography is probably number two in terms of our research methods. So let's talk about it. Okay, sorry. Fry I always laugh when I see Philip J. Fry. You can't tell if this is ethnography or hanging out. So ethnography, study of people and their culture in naturally occurring settings, right? So basically, when you're doing an ethnography, at least for a portion of it, you are going out into the world and observing people in their social milieu, right? In the places where they live and where they're socially active and all sorts of things, right? And typically the behavioral observation is done in an unstructured way. So you do this lots of ways. Either it's just by observing people. Sometimes I almost lost my microphone. You're interacting with them, discussing with them, and interviewing people. So ethnography in lots of ways itself can be a little bit of a mixed method, right? We tend to talk about it as one thing. I'll get to that in a minute. But it has a sort of element of being, a mixed method, mixed qualitative methods. Because you might, combine something like participant observation, which we'll talk about, and interviews, right, or even focus groups or something like that. Okay, so what is the goal of sorry, long day, ethnography? What is the goal of ethnography? I'm going to try that again. That did not work out. The goal of ethnography. Basically, you want to observe people in their communities, right, in their actual social lives, and describe it from the point of view of the participant and with as little reactivity as possible, right? You want to minimize the impact of you as a researcher being there. So that is the goal of ethnography. And basically, you do this by immersing yourself in a particular social setting for typically, a long period of time. Now, long is a somewhat vague way of putting it. This can be weeks, this can be months, this can be years, depending on the ethnography. Long, honestly, is very subjective. Could even be hours, right? Like if you're going to say a furry convention, right? The convention is for a weekend. You spend the weekend immersed in that world. That's an ethnography that's maybe a couple of days long. So long is a kind of relative statement here. Okay, and the joke here is that sometimes ethnography seems a little bit like hanging out with people, right? And I've certainly heard, I can't remember his last name, it's Randall, but I forget his first name now. Contreras, Randall Contreras, did this basically hanging out with Latino gang members in LA, right? They tended to go and play basketball at like community leagues in Los Angeles. And what did he do to, find out more about kind of aging Latino gang members? He went and he hung out at these community leagues and played basketball with them, right? And that was a big, aspect of his ethnography. So sometimes it might feel a little bit like hanging out. Okay. Sometimes these two terms get kind of mixed together, right? Participant observation and ethnography sometimes kind of get mixed together a little bit. So people will say like they were doing an ethnography in terms of doing a participant observation. They're often used kind of synonymously. However, there is a kind of distinction here that is worth making. Particularly, ethnographies will often involve more than just participant observation, right? Participant observations, they're often used synonymously, but ethnography is a more inclusive term, right? So it will include individual interviews, sometimes content analysis, right? Studying documents or artifacts from the community, not just participant observations. Though someone might be doing a participant observation and tell you that they're doing an ethnography, even though they're just doing the participant observation part. So technically, participant observation is a subcategory of ethnography. And like I said, ethnography in a lot of ways is a mixed method. So you'd be taking, right, participant observation, content analysis, I don't know what artifacts from the community would be. It's a little bit more anthropological, but you'd be taking different, and interviews, right? So these are all things that would make up ethnography at the end of the day. So to make it even more confusing, ethnography is also the term people use to describe the written portion, right? So when you write up your qualitative research, where you did an where you did participant observation, you did content analysis, you wrote an ethnography, right? So the term is used in a couple of different ways, which can get a little bit confusing. An ethnographic research, where does it have its origins? Right, in anthropology, right? This is like Margaret Mead. Have you ever taken like Intro to Anthropology, where Margaret Mead went and lived with the Polynesian Islanders or whatever it was and described their sexual practices inaccurately, I might note, because she overinterpreted certain things to make a point. That was an ethnography, right? Going to live with these Polynesian tribes people. But we've adopted it into sociology, where you can now go hang out with bikers or furries or Turkish immigrants or whatever it happens to be. These are all considered ethnographies in the same way, hopefully without some of the negative connotations that ethnographies in early anthropology had. Okay. So when you're doing an ethnography, like any other kind of qualitative method, interviews is the same, but even more so in an ethnography, access to the field is a big question and a big problem that you often have to solve. Now, generally speaking, like we can talk about two types of settings where you can do ethnographies, open settings and closed settings. Open settings are not hard to get access to, right? Open settings are any kind of public space, public places, sidewalks, parks, university campus, right? Anywhere you would want to go to make observations that's public and open and you have access to without asking anyone's permission, right? Easy to access, but with some limitations, right? It's going to be hard to do things like informed consent. Open settings, it might be hard to make like really detailed observations or talk to people, right? Because you're just going out in public and trying to get access to people. Closed settings are any kind of setting where you might be interested in doing research, but there's some kind of boundary or gatekeeper restricting your access, right? So let's say that you wanted to do research in a workplace, right? So you wanted to go and do research at, Enterprise Rent-A-Car. Why not? And you wanted to do some research at Enterprise Rent-A-Car about their corporate structure or how they treat female employees, how female employees interact with aggressive male customers, and this is the kind of ethnography that you want to do, right? You would have to get permission from that corporation or from a location or whatever it happens to be, right? So it's a closed setting because in order to be there, you have to have someone that's going to let you be there. And these are much more difficult, right? And these are the things that you're going to have to negotiate potentially if you're ever doing an ethnography. Even sometimes in open settings, right? So I was talking about Randall Contreras and his research into these Latino gangs. Technically speaking, he was going to a public setting as well. These community centers are public places where, supposedly anyone's welcome. But in order to kind of bridge that, it had a kind of closed aspect to it where, reformed or reforming or non-reformed aging Latino gang members wouldn't necessarily talk to people just out of the blue, right? So he actually had to negotiate, even in this public space, access to these people to get them to talk to him, right? So he had to find someone to introduce him. He had to change how he pronounced his name to make it more Latino, right? Because he's a very Anglophone Latino. So I remember him talking about, he's like, I had to really start rolling my R's. He wasn't Randall Contreras, he was Randall Contreras, right? These kinds of, my Spanish R is not that great. But there's often negotiations that happen to get access to the people in open settings because they might not be willing to talk to you either. So there can be those kinds of negotiations. Okay. So, two other kinds of ethnographies we can talk about. So, overt ethnographies, right? So loud. Overt ethnographies are basically those where people know that they are being observed by a researcher. So you go right to the furry convention, and you are wearing your name tag that says Jeffrey Brassard, furry researcher, right? I don't know if that's a good idea, right? And you don't go dressed as a furry. You don't go, you're wearing a shirt and tie or, whatever you want, business casual attire, and you have a name tag that identifies you as someone who is doing research. So you are right out there, right? It is overt, out in the open who you are. So that one's easy, right? Covert ethnography is where people don't know that they are being observed by a researcher. So, right, you want to study furries. So you go down to Furries Are Us, and you purchase I don't know how you buy a furry suit or whatever, but you go down to the Furry Emporium and you buy yourself a fursona costume, right? You become, a 6-foot-tall cat named Snowball, and you go into the furry convention, basically pretending to be amongst them, right? Or you go to the AA meeting, and instead of being like, I'm a researcher interested in people recovering from alcohol abuse, you're like, hello, my name is Jeff Brassard, and I'm an alcoholic, right? And you pretend that, right, I'm not an alcoholic, but although this semester is driving me to it. You pretend that you're part of the group so that you can, and obviously the advantage here is, non-reactive, right? In a covert scenario, it's non-reactive. People will think that you're there not to research them, so they'll act more naturally. Overt ethnographies, right? You're going to have many more reactive effects. So it's a little bit harder to know what might be genuine social behavior and what might be people putting on airs, right? Sometimes trying to help you. Sometimes they're like guessing at what you want to know, and so they might actually kind of try to give it to you. So, what was I saying? Right. Covert ethnographies, you tend to do them where you're worried about reactive effects. However, there's lots of ethical concerns, and it's difficult to implement. The ethical concerns obviously have to do with informed consent of the participants, right? If people don't know that you're there doing research, they cannot consent to it. So if you're going to do a covert ethnography, you have to clear ethics, and there have to be a really clear rationale for why the research could not be conducted overtly, right? So overt is far preferable. It's much better in general. It's going to get much easier ethics clearance. You have to make a really strong case, that basically the reactive effects are going to so taint the data that you really need a covert ethnography, and that somehow, the violation of people's privacy and their inability to give informed consent is outweighed by the value of the research you're doing. So it's a tough bar to clear. Okay. Okay. So, all right. These are some examples, right, of kind of open, on this grid. So we've got on our one axis, right, whether you're in an overt role or a covert role, and on this axis, whether it's an open or a closed setting, right? And so we have some different examples of different ethnographies, right? So Wilson's 2000 study of Toronto raves, right? They went into raves and basically overtly said that they were researchers, right? They didn't hide it. They said they were researchers, And anyone could go to these raves. They were public, open events. As long as you bought a ticket, you were allowed entrance, and that's what they did. And Totten's 2001 study of youth gang members, right? They approached youth gang members as researchers, saying who they were. Okay. This is a weird piece of research, by the way, and one that I think is now flagged as being inherently kind of problematic, going back to 1990, so it's now, 35 years old. Oh, that makes me feel old. Okay. So, what did DeRoche do? Well, basically, he had done this earlier research where he went into public bathrooms where gay men tended to have sex. This is, again, before a lot of acceptance of the LGBTQ movement. So gay men tend to meet in these public places, bathhouses, and public washrooms to have sex. And DeRoche basically went there and kind of, because it's an open setting, he recorded what they were doing, but he pretended to be just a member of the public, right? Or I can't remember if it was a member of the public or a gay man, to update people on how gay men behaved in these settings. Now, this, I think, today is seen as somewhat unethical, right? Because this is a marginal population, and his research is a little bit exploitative in terms of being, covert in this role. Okay. What's the closed setting and overt role? You have these two. Krabenau's study of Canadian youth shelters, again, where they had to negotiate the entry into these youth shelters with the staff who worked there, but they went in an overt role. They're like, hey, we're researchers. We want to observe and talk to people in this space. And same thing with Restuhl's research on Indigenous youth, right? It was a closed, or Indigenous students, right? They went into educational spaces inhabited by Indigenous students, but they were overt about it, right? They were like, we're researchers. We're here to talk to you. The fourth one is the one that I always find kind of funny. Not funny, but interesting, right? This is our closed setting covert role, and this is Lauder's research, or discussion of covert research on Heritage Front, right? So Heritage Front is a neo-Nazi group, and basically Lauder infiltrated Heritage Front principally online, pretended to be a member of Heritage Front or an associated neo-Nazi group, and then sort of observe their conversations and the discourses that they were having internally to try and understand, better how these communities function, what the hierarchies are, what the discussions are. And basically, Lauder made the case that, look, the second they knew you were a researcher, they would never speak publicly. They would never be honest about what they're doing. So he had to have a covert role. So there, bless you. There definitely is space in research for this kind of thing, but you have to make a really strong case. The other thing that you might have to worry about in a case like this, right? Let's say that you're like, okay, I want to infiltrate a neo-Nazi group, like the Republican Party. No, I'm kidding. Sorry. That's a cheap shot at the Republican Party. I don't really think that. It was just the joke that was right out there. You wanted to infiltrate a neo-Nazi group. The thing that you probably get asked, is about researcher safety. Is it safe to infiltrate this group? Like, what if they discover who you actually are? Would you be putting yourself in jeopardy as a researcher? And you might say, like, oh yeah, but I'm fine with it. But almost guaranteed, like, if you've ever had to fill out the University of Alberta's, the field work manuals for saying how you're going to be safe, you'd realize that there's no way that they would ever let you do something that would put you at risk. We had some researchers for our prison research. They have to fill these out like every time they get in a car. It's like, what are the dangers of being in a car? Well, we could get into an accident or maybe slip on the ice in the parking lot of the prison as we're walking there. Silly things like this. So safety has become a much bigger concern, and I doubt you would get this pass now because spying on neo-Nazi groups is going to be bad. Okay. Yes, please.
Just out of curiosity, for the final, will we have to know these exact studies for each kind?
No. I won't ask you about these specific ones. I just give them as examples, right? And they're a little bit more shall we say, precise than the examples I would just make up. Especially this one, right? Like, where would you be allowed to do this kind of thing? There's also been research like on Hell's Angels, where people have posed as like a member of the Hell's Angels. But again, some of that stuff was done like back in the 80s and 90s, before people cared about researcher safety, presumably. But yeah, you don't have to know the specific studies. I won't ask you about Krabenau's, what was the purpose? Because that's way more detailed than I care about, right, in terms of the final. But is that good? Okay, no problem. All right, other questions? Nay. Okay. Closed settings. How do you get access to a closed setting? So there's lots of different ways, right? How do you get access? So if you know someone, right, friends, contacts, colleagues, you can get access to these closed research settings, right? So usually like some kind of introduction, right? Someone knows someone. This can happen in the weirdest kinds of ways. So I went to one academic conference, kind of at the beginning of my PhD research, and I did my presentation, and then someone approached me, and he happened to work for like a Hollywood studio, and he was like, "Hey, I know a bunch of people. Would you like me to introduce you to them?" And I was like, "Yes, please. That would be fantastic." Sometimes you get lucky with people, recommending you, but basically, a lot of times when it comes to getting access to closed environments, you're going to need some kind of way in, right? And if you know someone, right, that can be a big advantage, even in writing your research proposal, right? Because one of the questions that might come from your candidacy committee when you're doing a PhD is how likely is it that you're going to actually be able to complete this research, right? Do you have actual contacts that could get you in the door, right? So if you happen to, let's say you want to study engineering companies and the way female engineers navigate a predominantly male environment and field, right? And you can say, oh, well, my sister or my cousin or my dad works for an engineering company, so I have an in already at these places, right? That's going to make it a lot easier, and it's going to be a much easier sell when it comes to getting in, right? Or if your dad is a Hell's Angel and you're like, yeah, of course, no, that's probably unlikely, but maybe. Okay, so contacts, colleagues, someone who can introduce you, right? Gatekeepers, someone who knows the key participants and controls access to the settings. This can be a lot of people. I know with like the prison research, this has been like the Ministry of Justice, right, in Alberta Justice. Key ministers are the kind of gatekeepers. They grant you access, right? They write the policy documents that get you access into the space. But these are going to be people who know, how to get into the spaces. They control access. They're gatekeepers. Sometimes the gatekeeper can be like, it can be as mundane as like, this is going to sound dumb, but the receptionist. The receptionist at any kind of office or business, in a lot of cases, or the administrative assistant, a lot of times they serve as a gatekeeper, right? Because they are filtering access. You're going to send emails, or you're going to phone and contact people, or you're going to show up somewhere hoping that you can gain access. And it's often like the person who's the gatekeeper that controls whether you actually get to talk to anyone is sometimes the receptionist, right? And they can be like, oh yeah, let me book you an appointment with Mr. Smith, or whatever it happens to be. So generally the gatekeeper, will introduce the researcher to the field, right? Let you actually access it, introduce you to key players. Sometimes people can give you more access, but generally like, gatekeepers are really important. And if you kind of, flunk out with the gatekeeper, often the research gets really, really, really hard to do. Okay. So you can also get someone in an organization to be your sponsor, right, to bring you in, probably introduce you to the field, maybe introduce you or get you past the gatekeeper, basically vouch for you. It's like, hey, this is a good person, right? They are their research is really interesting. You should really talk to them. We should really grant them access, right? So sometimes this is like you've interested someone, you met someone, someone's interested in the research, and they're able to like get you in the door, right? And then, or sometimes you can offer, right, offer something in return. Obviously, something, not money or anything inappropriate. A copy of the finished study. Sometimes that's good. Most people don't care to read academic research, but if you have something to offer in exchange, right? Whether maybe it's a presentation you could do to a group, right, or something like that, you can offer things in return for access to closed settings as well. Okay. So, to get access to closed settings, couple of things you need to keep in mind. You need to very clearly explain your aims and methods. And if this ever changes, right? If, say, your method changes, like you go from one, you go from interviews, but then you want to add something, you really have to then go through and restate this. You have to be honest about these things, right? You cannot trick people, because if they find out they've been tricked, they will revoke your access really, really quickly. Terms of access, are things that you also have to think about. And this is actually true in a lot of cases, even with something like interviews, right? We don't really tend to think about it, but if you're doing interviews, you might have certain participants that have conditions under which they will agree to be interviewed. So I had one person that I interviewed, really smart guy, really knew. Oh, I need to add time, or the projector will turn off. Oh no. Okay, we're good. Really knew the reason. Like, he was a TV executive from Britain, and I was talking to him because he'd worked in Russia. But one of his conditions was that before I used any of his quotes, he wanted me to basically pull out any quotes that I was going to use from him and let him review them so that he could edit them. And unfortunately, he edited some of the juicier ones where he would curse, because British people have very, shall we say, colorful curses. And he edited those out. He's like, I don't really believe in this quote. And I'm like, you don't like the swears? He's like, I don't like the swears. I'm like, okay, well, we'll take the swears out and it'll be better. He referred to something as a big dick measuring contest. He was like, could I phrase that a different way? I'm like, I'm sure you could. He's like, there was some male dominance competitions going on. I'm like, well, I mean, that's less evocative, but sure. Anyway, it wasn't dick measure. It was like, the guy came in swinging his big dick around, but it was metaphorical. And I was like, okay, that your quote is, he came in being very dominant and showing his dominance. I'm like, but I like the way you said it better the first time. It was more fun. He's like, yeah, but I don't really want to be quoted saying that. I'm like, I guess that's fair, right? Things like that. It was he was like my favorite interview ever. So you have to be willing, obviously, to negotiate the terms of access, right? And again, this can be your access to something like a prison or an AA group, right? It's like, okay, it might be something like you can come and you can observe, but you can't talk to anyone, right? You can come to the furry convention, but you have to stand in the corner and not talk to anyone. And we're going to put you in a glass booth, so all you can do is look around. I don't know, right? There can be lots of different kind of conditions that people have. And then you might be like, well, I really would like to just talk to maybe like 5 people. And they're going to be like, well, how about 3, right? So there's going to be all sorts of different negotiations depending, where you can be, right? If you're going into a prison, where are you going to do your interviews? Are they out on the floor, in the unit, in the break room, right? Whatever it happens to be, all of these things need to be negotiated beforehand. Oh, this one's really important, because this is going to get people really ticked off if you screw this one up. How much time is your research going to take, right? And how intrusive is it going to be to the people that are there, right? For example, if you say you're going to be there for a week and 4 weeks later you're still there, people are going to get really, really mad at you because they're going to feel like you lied to them and you're wasting their time, right? So Be open about how much time your research is going to take. If anything, overestimate. This, by the way, is true with interviews as well, right? If you say your interview is going to be an hour and a half, make sure you keep it to an hour and a half. Or at the hour and a half mark, be like, hey, we've hit an hour and a half. I know I don't want to take up too much of your time. Do you mind if we keep going, or do you need to go, right? Stuff like that. Respecting people's time is a huge thing. I did that lots, and where people are like, no, I'm having so much fun with this conversation. Let's talk for longer, and 2-3 hours later, you're still talking. So, in covert research, adopt a suitable role, right? So, you can imagine. But again, chances are you're not going to ever do covert research unless you have a really interesting career path, in which case I take it back. Yeah, Reg.
I was wondering for how much time you'll have to say that to the research ethics board, like how long it'll take, or does that not really matter?
You can give them an estimate, but it's not. I mean, well, who's going to care more about that, say, as if you're doing a master's or a PhD, your supervisor or your committee, right? You don't necessarily need to tell the research ethics board how long the research is going to take. I'm trying to think. It's been a while since I applied for it. I mean, ethics, you're applying for a certain period of time, after which you have to renew your ethics. But I don't think you have to tell them you're going to be in there for a week, or you don't have to be quite that specific with ethics. But when you're actually approaching someone, you definitely need to tell them, I'm going to be here for a month, right, or a week or a year, so that they know, right? And that's part of informed consent too. They knew you didn't trick them into participating in the research and all that fun stuff. Good?
Yeah.
Okay. Ta-da. Oops, these are my circles from last year, and I can't erase them. And I'm sad. Okay. All right. Open settings, right? Much easier. My background is super colorful. Potentially, right, depending on what kind, you might still need to get sponsors or gatekeepers. And that's kind of what I was talking about with Randall Contreras, right? Where he had to actually get people to introduce him to Latino gang members in LA, right? To kind of, get them used to his presence so that they would talk to him, this kind of thing, right? So you might still need to get, sponsors and gatekeepers on site, because sometimes even in open settings, there are kind of semi-closed things or groups that might just not want to let you in. Hanging around, and this was Randall's thing too, just hanging around, this is what White's Street Corner Society was one of these studies, but that's not important, right? Hanging around a group to kind of get people used to your presence, get them used to you, even if you're being, hey, I'm researching, I just want to talk to you guys, and just kind of being present so that people kind of learn that they can trust you and they settle down. But obviously, it's hard to get the acceptance of strangers. So, gatekeepers and prominent members of communities are going to really help in this regard. Okay. I have to do something quickly because I can't write on my slides if there's already writing. So give me one moment. Info, check for issues. And remove all. Okay, there we go. Much better. If you ever wondered, is there a really straightforward way to remove ink from a Microsoft Excel or a PowerPoint document? There is not. Okay, stream is still going. We're good. Okay. So, is that where I was? I'm just checking. All right. Ongoing access, right? It can be extremely problematic. People sometimes do get suspicious of you as a researcher. They'll start to wonder why you're really there, right? So maintaining access can be somewhat difficult. Group members, right? And this can be anything, right? Workplace, if you were doing gang research, right? Or prison research, Group members might start to worry that what they say will get back to bosses or colleagues in negative ways. Even like if you were doing a workplace study and you're eventually going to publish the results, right? People might not want to talk to you because they might worry that what you're going to publish, then their boss is going to read, and they're going to know that their boss is going to know that they hate them, and that's going to put them in a negative position. So people being studied might sometimes decide to sabotage the research or simply not cooperate, right? To basically get in your way, not cooperate. This stuff happens. So it is a constant challenge, and you kind of have to navigate things really, really carefully in terms of keeping access to sites. And I know this is something like you kind of have to judge. I know with the prison research that's been going on at the CCR, keeping the correctional officers on board so that they basically allow continued access and they don't throw up any barriers is something that there's kind of ongoing emphasis on, right? I think they're bribed by Donut mostly. But, because you don't want a particular group to sabotage the research or get you kicked out or throw up barriers in front of you. So there is all that. So, what time is it? Oh, wow. Time flies when you're talking about ethnographies. To maintain your access, right? Play up your credentials, right? Oh, you're a researcher, right? You're a PhD student at the University of Alberta or whatever it happens to be, right? So that can help. I like this one because this is just like solid advice. Don't give people a reason to dislike you, right? Don't give people a reason to dislike you. So don't get in the way. Don't make snarky comments. Don't, especially like this can be hard sometimes. And I know some prison researchers struggle with this because they don't always love correctional officers, right? Because they have a sense of the prison system as a creator of great inequality. But don't be snarky to the correctional officers if you're doing prison research and they're key to giving you access, right? Don't give people a reason to dislike you. This can get your access cut really quickly. I'll even give you a story. I had a kind of an acquaintance, and they were a professor at UCLA, and they had a grad student. And this grad student was basically, they wanted to do a study of this old kind of movie called Roots, right? It was kind of about African American experience. And one of the things they did is they got the professor got them an interview with the director who made it, who was now an executive at Warner Brothers, and they've been promised all this access. This person was going to like help them connect with the producers and the set designers and all that stuff. And basically, they went in, started their first interview, and kind of made a hash of it. Right, insulted the person right off the bat. Said something like, "Oh, I really like Roots, but I didn't care for your later work as much. I thought Roots was the best thing you ever did," which made this person really upset. And then basically, because they disliked them, they cut off the whole access they had promised, stopped responding to emails, and was like, "Okay, we're done." So you definitely do not want to do that, right? Don't give people a reason to dislike you. Be the nicest version of yourself while you're doing research. Thank people. Be grateful for the time they're giving you, right? I sound like Donald Trump now. Oh dear. I don't mean to. Right? You got to be grateful. You got to be nice. If there's little things that you can do to ingratiate yourself, like if it's like you're talking to police officers, and you know that police officers love donuts. That's a stereotype. You shouldn't actually bring donuts to police officers. They might take it the wrong way. But do little things that are going to make people like you. More than even actively, don't give people a reason to dislike you. Give them a reason to like you, because they'll go the extra mile if they like you. Okay, so play a role and construct a front. So this is a kind of weird one. Sometimes, I don't know how to put this. It's important, but I'm struggling to think of how to put this in polite terms. We all play roles, right? A man in his life will play many roles. No, that's not a direct Shakespeare quote, but it's sort of halfway from Macbeth. Sometimes you have to kind of put on like a facade, right? So you're not actually like, who you are. Okay, how would this look? You're doing, I don't know, let's say you're doing research on evangelical Christians, right? And you're a researcher and you've got like sleeve tattoos all the way down, right? And you're worried that, and you're not yourself an evangelical Christian, but you want to kind of get access to people and maintain access, right? You might have to put on a bit of a role, a constructive front, right? Act like you are in on the lingo, like you get what they're saying, right? You wear long sleeve shirts to cover up the sleeve tattoos, right? You put on a kind of a front so that people don't get offended, right? You put on the I don't know, I was going to say something about Mormons. I'm going to stop myself because I'd probably offend someone. I don't know who. The internet. I was going to say something about special underwear, but let's not go there. But you put on a kind of a front so that people are more likely to like you. I don't know. If you have certain kind of facial hair that looks, not what members of that community like, shave it off, right? Put on a front, construct a role, act like you fit in while you're there, or act in a way that they're going to find appropriate. Okay, so have a plan for allaying people's suspicions, right? If you think that people might be, suspicious of your motives as a researcher, or that things are going to get back to their bosses, be ready with a way of explaining how that's not going to happen, right? But try to think through the objections that people might have to you being there and work on that. Okay, and be prepared for tests of competence and credibility. People might question you, especially, if they think that you're, like sometimes, especially with academics, people like to challenge academics because they see academics sometimes as a sort of like, hoity-toity, if you will, like elitist occupation, and they might not like that. So they might try to challenge you. Oh, do you know this? Do you know that? Right? So be prepared for those kinds of tests of competence and credibility, right? They might question your credentials, whether you know something or not, and you should be able to answer those kinds of questions. I remember one. So again, this is interviewing, not ethnography, but I was interviewing the VP of Sony Russia, right? So I was interviewing the VP of Sony Russia. They're in Culver City, LA. And I got the distinct impression that this person did not actually want to talk to me, that they'd been sort of strong-armed by their boss. And so the first thing she did is when we started talking, she was like, oh, well, you've probably seen this show, right? There's all these shows that are on Russian TV. You've probably seen this show, right? And I was like, oh, yeah, I love that show. And I describe it a little bit. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's great. And what about this one? Did you see that one? I'm like, yeah, I've only watched a few episodes of that one, but sort of my impression was this. And about a half hour through this, like, hey, do you know this? Do you know this? She like switched and she was like, oh, well, you really know your stuff. And I'm like, yeah, I really know my stuff. I've been studying this for like years and years. And then from there, the conversation went super smoothly because she was convinced that I wasn't just and her impression was I was just some dumb PhD student that was like trying to interview her about something that I didn't know anything about and I was wasting her time. And then we had just like the nicest, most productive conversation. She actually let me go long, right? It was supposed to be an hour and a half and we actually went like 2.5 hours, had a great conversation. But she had to test my competence and my credibility first, that I actually knew what I was talking about. Once I'd cleared that bar, she was much more open. This kind of stuff will happen all the time, right? Where people will test whether you know things, right? Even if you're doing like, prison or police research, research with, people who are criminals, right? They will test you to see if you know what they're talking about. And sometimes, yeah, so some of that. I guess like this one is funny because I had a student, it was last year in this course, and they were like basically saying like I could never work with incarcerated people, right? Because I look like a cop. They're like, you need like at least a couple of visible piercings and maybe a visible tattoo before people would take you seriously. So if I ever wanted to do that kind of research, which thankfully I don't, I'd have to get like some tattoos that people could see. Hopefully not something lame either. I have to be really cool. A really cool tattoo. Okay. Apparently I look too much like a cop. White, bald, and middle-aged is apparently the description of cop. So, all right, key informants. How am I doing for time? Doing okay. How much do I have left? Lots. Okay, we're doing great. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that there's furries on slide 28. I don't know why that's important. It's really important to me. Okay, so key informants. Sometimes, right, key informants, there would be participants who are particularly knowledgeable or cooperative. It might not always be worth talking to everybody, right? Sometimes there are people in particular organizations that are going to know more than other people. So, key informants are those people. You might choose to use key informants if you suspect that, your kind of day-to-day people, your run-of-the-mill kind of participants might have less to say. So you often want to figure out who your key informants are, and whether if they're really knowledgeable and especially if they're cooperative, kind of start with those people. Now, obviously, the drawbacks to just using key informants is you might ignore other group members, right, in favor of the person who's really knowledgeable and cooperative. And, you might miss some of the nuance, right? Key informants' views might not be representative of the group as a whole. Often key informants are in leadership, right, or in higher echelons of organizations. So you do want to keep that in mind. Okay. So we're going to talk kind of a few, how many? I think there's 4. Yes. 4 different roles for ethnographers, right? So 4 different roles you can take on as an ethnographer. So the first one is complete participation, right? Complete participation, where basically, so this is a covert, right? A covert form of ethnography where basically, you adopt a secret role within the group and you participate fully in what's going on, right? So this is my theoretical example where I want to study the furries and I go and I get my fursona, I set myself up and I start attending furry-based events in full furry costume as though I were a furry, right? So you've got a secret role and you're participating entirely in it, right? So the advantage is obviously, it gets you closest to the participants and their activities. Now, obviously here, there's a risk of over-identification, right? Or developing a strong dislike of participants. So, 2 things might happen, right? You might, by participating fully in a group, you might actually start to like people in that group, right? Who knows? Maybe you don your fursona and then you meet someone and maybe you even fall in love with them. Who knows? It's a wild world, right? All sorts of weird things happen when you're doing research. That can skew your results, right? Because you then might want to paint that group which you now identify with or sympathize with in a positive light, right? Or if you develop a really strong dislike of participants or whole groups, right, you might be more inclined to paint them in a relatively negative light, which could, again, skew your, the results, skew the data that you're collecting. So it can be dangerous because you're so involved, right? You may actually skew your own data. So what you're going for is naturalism, right? You wanted naturalism. You wanted to not be intrusive. You wanted to observe things in their natural environment. What you actually end up with is you feeling so strongly about a group that you actually, skew your data. So, the risk. All right, our next kind of role, participant as observer. So, here, right, this is an overt one. You're in an overt scenario. The researcher adopts a role in the group. Participants are aware who the researcher really is. So I can think of a couple examples here. I was telling you, I think, last class about my friend Kelly, who in her master's research was doing research in World of Warcraft. And she developed a character called Survey Lady, right? So she was a character in World of Warcraft. Her title was Survey Lady. And she would do things like she would go along on raids with people, right? So she would, be like, hey, could I tag along with your group, right? So she would go on raids with, with these parties of people who were playing the game. So she adopted a role in the group, kind of as a follower. But people, because she was presenting herself as a researcher, as Survey Lady, people were aware of who she was. So she was being overt in what she was doing, but she was still participating in the group, right? Something too like our imagined example of someone going and observing, say, an AA meeting, but being clear that you are a researcher and everyone knows what you're doing, right? Again, that would be another example of participant as observer, right? You're sitting in the corner listening to people, or not listening to people, right? You'd be actually part of the group, sitting with people, listening to them. They know who you are. Maybe you're participating and throwing in your own 2 cents, right? So this is a high risk of reactivity because once people know what you're doing and why you're there, obviously they might start to act in ways that make them look favorable or whatever it happens to be. So something to keep in mind. Excuse me. Sorry. Observer as participant. So this is, you're there. People know who you are. But you would be kind of off in the corner, right? So the researcher observes and interviews from the edge of a group, right? Again, risk of reactivity is high. People might not tell you things or might act differently in the group if they know that you are there, right? So you can think of a lot of examples of this. Again, sorry, a little dizzy. Risk of, so let's just say you're not part of, say, the AA discussion, right? But you're observing a group of people at Alcoholics Anonymous because you want to see how those groups kind of organize themselves, what kind of discussions they have. So you're kind of off in the corner, right? They know who you are. They know that you're there. You don't participate in the discussions, but maybe you interview people, as on their way out, you talk to people, try to get interviews, but you're not actively participating in the group. Okay, risk of reactivity and obviously incorrect interpretations of activities because you're not participating and maybe you don't understand kind of some of the social norms that are going on. And if you can't get people to explain them to you, you might misunderstand what's actually happening. And then the complete observer. So this, what I would say is probably also quite rare in the sense that, being completely disengaged, not engaging participants at all is not an ideal kind of research position. But in a complete observer position is almost like, I don't want to say it this way, but I will. It's almost like you're at a zoo when you're watching people, right? You're not engaging with participants at all. They wouldn't necessarily know you're there, right? Because you're observing them from a distance. So you don't really have a risk of reactivity, but it would be really difficult to understand, the meaning of the actions of participants because you're just seeing them from the outside. So you're very much kind of limited to your own frame of reference in this kind of scenario. Yeah, please. Yeah, essentially. This is typically like covert, right? Because usually you're just watching. Yeah, I think because if you were overt, you'd be more in this situation, right, where you're observer as participant. If you're complete observer, people aren't going to know you're there, but you're also not interacting, right? So as opposed to complete participant, where you would be interacting like you're a member of the group, here you're not engaging at all. You're just like there, right? Maybe you're even watching through CCTV cameras or whatever. But yeah, this is very much that. Okay. So this is our kind of, roles for ethnographers, right? From complete involvement to complete detachment. And, it's along a kind of a spectrum. So there you go. So should you be active or passive? It really depends on, and how active or passive along this scale should you be. it really depends on what kind of research you're doing, right? If you're wanting, if it's necessary to maintain credibility in the minds of people or to really get access to their thoughts, their feelings, their thinking, right, you might have to take on a more active role, right? Especially if you suspect that, something like a participant as observer, sorry, let me rephrase that you need to be a complete participant or at least a participant as observer to really get access to the group, that the second you're in this role, things are kind of going to shut down. And certainly that you're not going to get the information in a complete observer role. You might have to take a more active role in the research, right? Be part of the discussions, interact with people on a more meaningful basis. However, right, an active role may be physically dangerous for you and might have ethical implications, right? Something like studying crime, if you're putting yourself at risk, right? And it could, right? Potentially, let's say you wanted to study the Hells Angels and they're in a turf war with other groups, right? You could be putting yourself in danger just by playing an active role in this, right? Gang research famously, right? You could be kind of putting yourself in danger and not even really understand. So you really have to judge, your active or passive role based on, is it worth it for the data you're going to get? And what are the risks to both you and to participants in terms of what role you might be putting them in? Okay. Field notes. So field notes are super important with ethnographic research. I would say with interviews as well. Interview field notes are a little bit different. We'll talk about them when we talk about interviews as well. But field notes are really important. They're one of your key pieces of data that you use when you are doing an ethnography. So your field notes are essentially your notes to yourself, right? Detailed notes of events, conversations, and behaviors. And so what happened, what was said, what were people doing, and your initial reflections on them, right? And this is going to be a big source of data in any ethnography, right? What you saw, what happened, and what your initial understanding of it was. So what do we do with field notes, right? You write them down. So you typically, someone who is using ethnography as a method is going to do one of two things. Either you're going to actively be keeping them as you're doing the research, or you're going to come back to them and write them down at the end of the day. And I've seen both scenarios, right? So, especially if you're doing kind of overt research, you might be taking notes as you go, and that's fine. If you're doing covert research, obviously that's not going to work. So they should be written down as soon as possible, right? And this is essentially to combat one particular trend, and this is that we have bad memories. So one of the temptations, obviously, as a researcher is, as you're constructing a narrative, you might misremember things that happened in your ethnographic research so that they better fit the story that your research is trying to tell. And most people don't do this on purpose, right? But it's just your memory is going to subtly rewrite itself. And everybody does this, right? We all rewrite our memories constantly to make it kind of fit the story we tell about ourselves. You do that with your research as well. So the goal of field notes is to write down, what happened, what were your impressions, as close to the moment that it happened, so that later on you can go back and read your initial kind of account and impressions as close to that moment before your memory has had a chance to sort of rewrite itself and retell those events in a way that's more favorable to what you were trying to figure out, right? So there's that. Some people will actually record audio of everything they're doing, right? Interactions with people. Maybe you throw on a GoPro and you're filming people, as you move through the furry convention. That might be a little awkward. I don't know. But it's certainly something that would be possible. However, and this can help, avoid, you can talk to yourself and give your impressions of what's going on the GoPro. Sometimes people will use like an audio recorder as well at the end of the day. They'll like give themselves voice memos and talk to themselves about what happened. You'll have to transcribe that though, to get that as close as possible. One of the things with field notes too, I guess I should say, let me say this last point and then I'll talk about field notes in a sec. Photography, video recordings can be used as options in some settings as well to like record what happened, and then you're really, really close to the events. One thing that can happen with field notes, and we're seeing this increasingly with a lot of journals, is that like if you submit, your paper to a journal, they can request, and you go through a kind of audit process where they're trying to judge, how accurate you're being. Journals can actually request your field notes, right? And publishers may do this for books as well if they're being really cautious. Let's say your topic is really sensitive. So your field notes are part of your data. You can cite them in your writing, but also they can be audited, right? So it's important to really get them right. They are a key piece, and and now increasingly they're becoming part of these publicly available data sets where people might get access to your field notes, in order to audit the research that you're doing. So keep that in mind as well. But yeah, really important. The key part is to get them down so that you can't, decide later that this is what that actually happened at that event. You can't misremember it because you recorded it and you can go see your field notes. And that kind of solidifies your memory at a point in time. Okay. So, types of field notes. Mental notes, right? Remember and write later. So if you're in the middle of an event, right, and it would be, obtrusive for you to take out your notepad or your iPad and start writing stuff down, right? People, you can imagine a scenario where, you're talking to someone or you're observing people and someone's like, what are you writing? No, what are you writing? Like, what are you doing? Why are you writing stuff down, right? You can imagine that. So you might make a mental note. It's like, I need to remember to write this later, right? Now you have to remember to do the write later part so that you have the, because you then transition into field notes. Jotted, sometimes called scratch or rough notes, which are basically brief notes made at the time to refresh your memory when writing your detailed notes, right? So some people use like those little flippy pads, or sometimes people now use the note functions on their phones just to write like, really quick jotted notes, like usually point form, so that, when you go to write your field notes, because let's say you're doing research for a full day, man, a lot can happen in a day. So like every hour, maybe you stop like, once an hour and you jot down some notes, right? 1 hour. You write down, what happened in this hour, boom, 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 right? And then at the end of the day, after your 12 hours in the field, then you go and you write your full note, right? And your full notes are basically, the really detailed notes of what you saw, heard, and your reflections on the situation, including what was my role in the events of the day, where was there maybe reactivity, all these things, as much as you can write down. And field notes, right, are very much an art. You get better at them as you practice, but it's putting as much detail into what happened in that day. It can go minute by minute, hour by hour, conversation by conversation, whatever it happens to be. I will say, like, this is for ethnography. This is for ethnography. I also do these when I do interviews. So if I do an interview, or when I've done focus groups, I always have field notes as well, right? So like after an interview, when I've done interviews with people, I will sit down and just write every impression I had of what happened during that interview, right? What the person's mood was, how it went. Were there moments that kind of stuck out to me? All of these sorts of things and some of my initial interpretations. Again, to kind of lock in place how you felt at that moment after you did the interview, so that later on you can't go and be like, that was the best interview ever and actually went horrible or something like that, right? So you can do that with interviews as well, and I almost always do it. When I've done focus groups, like when I did focus groups for the one research project I did, I actually had and this is actually really common for focus groups, I actually had a grad student kind of with me, and their job was to assemble the field notes in real time, right? So they were jotting down, like, as people are having a discussion, what people's moods were, like what their body posture was, like, were these people seeming impatient? Like, how did they react to the questions? All of this stuff, so that when I went back and wrote up kind of the research, I had kind of access to that in the moment observation, right? So that would be, and I also did field notes after the focus group, but they were kind of jotted notes in the moment from a grad student. So all very valuable. And you can use them in lots of different situations. This is for ethnography, but like highly recommend using them for interviews or focus groups as well. Okay. How are we doing? 13 minutes? A few slides left. Okay, let's keep going. All right, we'll go for a couple more, and then maybe we'll end, because I know it's a lot of information all at once. Okay, so analytic memos. Basically, analytic memos you would typically write if, in the process of doing your ethnography, you sort of start to think, you start to link observations to concepts, right? So if you want to, kind of start to theorize about what the data might mean, right? So I don't know, you were out with the furries, right, one day at the furry convention making your observations, right? And you're like, okay, I think this links to, Freud's theory of, I don't know what, some kind of theoretical position on subcultures. Like, oh, I see Dick Hebdage's thinking on subcultures in what I've been doing with the furries. You would basically write that as an analytic memo, right? You would say, okay, so what's today, March 3rd, observed this, and here's where, I think this theory applies. I'm seeing this theoretical concept kind of linking, this concept that I'm thinking of, I'm starting to see this application theoretically. Now, typically you keep these separate from the data notes, right? So it can be a way of you sort of thinking about, so not with your field notes, right? You're going to set them up as a separate kind of document, keep them in a separate place. Was that a hand up, or you were adjusting your glasses or something? Okay. So you can start to reflect on like the meaning of things, but you want to keep them separate from, say, your field notes, so that when you go back through your field notes, those kinds of initial analytic kind of memos, or your kind of theory thinking, isn't actually then re-influencing your field notes, right? So you wouldn't want to have them like say in your field notes and then have them in a column beside, because you don't want one to influence the other, right? You want to keep your field notes relatively clean, pristine, and all of that stuff, especially if then people might audit it, right? You want to make sure of that. Okay. Okay, visual ethnography. As I like to call it, scrapbooking. It's a joke, kind of. Visual ethnography, right, typically, we had someone do a presentation on visual ethnography, and it sounded kind of interesting. I've always thought of it as kind of a weird methodology, and I'm not that big a fan of it, but it takes all kinds of people, in academia. So visual ethnography is typically an ethnography that obviously uses visual materials, right? Either photographs, pictures, films, or videos as sources of data, documents, or illustrations of participant stories, right? So sometimes people will go and, record or have people record things happening in their life, and then put that together. And sometimes the output of visual ethnography, which again I find a really weird methodology, is almost like a documentary, or found footage. It sometimes seems like. But basically, it's to try and get really, really close to participants' points of view, and use that as sources of data. So yeah, you can use visual material as memory aids, kind of like field notes. But I think where I've seen people use visual ethnography is they use it as data in its own right. They use that as the actual data that they're basing their accounts on. Now, obviously, the advantage to something like a visual ethnography is the verisimilitude, right? It's very much close to life, right? It's hard to distort what happened. It's hard to refigure it and remember it differently if, say, you have a video recording or a picture, because it is that kind of real life representation. Yeah, these things are produced in the process of research. So, you know, a videographer, a researcher is videoing things as they talk to people. So it is definitely a method. It's not one you see super commonly, but it is around. I mean, this one, prompts for discussion, I've never actually seen anyone do, but you could use visual material to get people talking about something that happened, you know, something that's going on in their communities, and use that as a sort of, you know, way of getting at people's reactions. You know, interview them with visuals attached. Okay. Okay. How are we doing? Like, should I try to get through the rest of ethnography today? No, that's too many slides. Too many slides. Okay. Let's do one more. We'll finish visual ethnography. Okay, we have two more on visual ethnography. And we'll stop after visual ethnography, but don't pack up yet. Okay, so, yeah, obviously people have theorized on visual ethnography's role, or the role of visual material, and you can kind of take two approaches. The realist approach, which basically is like documentary, right? You take what is recorded as the fact, right? The representation of what actually happened, and therefore kind of unimpeachable, right? Or the reflective approach, or reflexive approach, sorry. Basically, understanding that researchers will film certain things, right? They will influence what materials reveal, right? They are choosing to video certain things and maybe not certain others, and tends to view, you know, visual materials as useful, but something that needs to be interpreted as well in terms of how the researcher may shape them. And then, yeah, recognizes that visuals might be collaborative with the creation of them might be collaborative with the participants, and might be subject to multiple interpretations, right? That maybe what the researcher sees is not the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and that other people in the process might actually have other perspectives. So sometimes, you know, with this reflexive approach, you might include interviews to kind of get people's perspectives on that visual material, right? So again, you can see where ethnography always has this kind of multi-methods way of doing it. Okay, photo voice. Photo voice takes collaboration even further. And I will be honest, I'm sure it exists, but I've never actually seen an example of photo voice. I've only read about it in like methods manuals. So I'm like, I struggle to even think of where this has happened. I'm sure it has, because I don't know everything. But basically, this is where people like honestly take pictures of their daily lives or daily experiences, interpret them from their own perspectives, and you as the researcher basically just record that, right? Now, I think obviously you would see this, I think, more with like participatory action research, where a measure of the power and control is taken out of the hands of the researcher and given to participants, right? So this is like people get to tell their own stories. Oops. You know, tell their own stories. I probably didn't need to write that, but I like writing on my slides. You know, it can be used with people from marginalized communities. You know, if there's especially if there's a fear that, you know, the researcher might be imposing a kind of elite agenda. But yeah, it's often, you know, part of participatory action research, allowing people to tell their own stories. And I say that often, even though I can't remember ever having seen it. So, but again, I think participatory action research is a little bit rarer than other forms of research. Okay, we have 4 minutes left. Why don't we stop there? Because I don't want to do sampling and ending the research. So we'll pick this up on Wednesday. We'll finish ethnography and move on to interviews, qualitative interviews, right? We'll start talking qualitative interviews on Wednesday. And we have what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Wow, we have more classes left than I thought. Oh dear, I hope I have enough material. We'll figure it out. Okay, we'll see you Wednesday. On Wednesday. We'll see you on Wednesday. Hello. Oh, you're recorder. Yes.
Thank you.
There you go.